everybody, I am Jarrett Ross, the Genie Vlogger, and welcome back to another Professional Genealogist Reacts. On today's video, I will be reacting to How to Do Research by Overly Sarcastic Productions. Now, this is a channel I am familiar with. In fact, I was able to meet Blue a few years ago at one of the VidCon events. I don't think I was able to meet Red. I don't know if she was there, but I have seen a lot of their videos. I saw this video in my recommendations the other day, and when I saw it, it made me think that would be a great video to do a reaction to, just because research is obviously the biggest thing with genealogy, because we constantly are researching to prove the family trees in various ways or disprove the family trees. So as we watch this video, I'm going to try to relate it to genealogical research stuff, and I'll probably also talk a bit about the genealogical proof standard, which is the standard with which we judge proof statements from genealogy. So basically, what conclusions people come up with genealogically. But we'll talk more about that in a bit. Let's jump into the video.
Hey everybody, so in the months since I put out the Dionysus video, I've gotten a few emails from people asking about my sources and my process and all that jazz, and around the third time I had to answer one of those emails, I had a sudden epiphany. Maybe this process isn't as intuitive as I thought. So today I'm going to share some sweet wisdom with all of you who've ever wondered, how the heck do I do research? Now I'm going to start at the very beginning of the process, and it's probably not what you're expecting to hear. This may be a bit shocking, and I'd advise elderly members of the audience to take a seat first, maybe check their blood pressure before I get to it. We good? Everyone sitting comfortably? Okay, the absolute first step to any research project is Wikipedia. No, really, I learned this in university from
JJ McCullough, if he watched this, he must have just been flipping a shit. If you don't know, he has a whole video all about why Wikipedia is bad and you just shouldn't use it at all. I disagree with a lot of that video, and I actually had it in my list of reactions as a possibility after I saw this video, because that one came up as maybe that would be a good one to react to. So maybe I'll do that one in the future. Comment below if you want me to react to JJ's Wikipedia video.
We all learned years ago that you're never supposed to cite Wikipedia. And this is completely true. Nobody trusts it as a source. It'd be like citing something you read off the side of a subway car. But what Wikipedia is good at is directing you to actual sources. Right at the bottom in that sweet little references section is a goldmine of all kinds of sources. And even better, the content of the article tells you what kind of information you can expect to find in those sources. And sometimes even what pages they're on. It's fantastic. You can get books, websites, translated primary sources, anything and everything from the reference section.
Now, with all of that said, it's very similar to when genealogists find somebody else's family tree. Whether it's a family tree built on Ancestry that only that person's worked on, or one of the collaborative trees such as Genie, WikiTree, or the family search tree. But whenever you find any of these family trees, you need to verify the information that it's giving you, because it's information that anyone can put up, in the same way that Wikipedia is information that anybody can put up. So it can be very useful, but you need to check into it. And that's also where the sources idea comes in that when you go to these family trees, depending on the sites or wherever you might find that tree, there may be sources available to you that are linked to that information. And this is one of the things that I think of all of the collaborative trees, WikiTree does come out on top in terms of the structure of the profiles and making the understanding of what's supporting that evidence. And for those who haven't recognized, the WikiTree, wiki as in Wikipedia, is very similar, and that's basically what all collaborative trees are in a sense, is like a Wikipedia for genealogy. And since I may have a lot of people watching this video who aren't familiar with collaborative trees, a collaborative family tree is where you have one big world tree that everyone merges their research into. So if you have a family tree that you've built and then you put in an ancestor that's already in the world tree, then you can merge that together, and now you're connected into that family tree, and you can build off of that and collaborate, thus the collaborative tree, together. So just like Wikipedia, people are collaborating to create an encyclopedia. But it's all about the sources, and that's where WikiTree, of all the collaborative tree, really comes out on top. Genie, I think, is a close second. Family Search is really good on some of the family trees, most especially if they're LDS Mormon families. But that's also because the Family Search website is run by the LDS Church, or the Mormons. Thus why the trees on there for the Mormon families are really well sourced.
As you go through the relevant Wikipedia pages, any information that catches your eye will have a nice little citation on it. So grab that sucker and add it to the list. And when I say pages plural, I mean it. Pretty much everything has its own dedicated Wikipedia page, except for us. But that single page isn't going to be enough to get the full picture. You want to find every page that relates to the subject matter. Important places, related people or groups, relevant time periods, stuff like that.
This is actually very correlated to how we do genealogy research, and the best way to do it, in that when you're researching a family, you don't want to necessarily just focus on the records behind the family. You also want to focus on the bigger picture. What was the town that they lived at? Did they live in a specific neighborhood that was very unique? Maybe they lived in a specific community that was unique. What was the overall story of what was going on in that area while they were living there? And you can build a better picture of understanding what that life was like. And so similar to how she was looking at all of these various things that are tangential, we have a nickname for this type of research as well, called fan research, which is family, associates, and neighbors. Some people call it friends, associates, and neighbors. But the big idea is that when you're researching an ancestor, go beyond just the ancestor. You may find a lot more by looking at your ancestor's best friends. I have actually been in touch with so many family members of my ancestors' friends. And then as well, I've done a lot of community research where I've been able to work together with people from all these other families within a singular community. And you'd be surprised at the stuff that they have that might relate to your family. I don't know if everyone has it like this, but of all the things that you may have inherited, you probably have a lot of pictures and names that you've just never heard of or don't really know. Well, if you start looking into those, you might be surprised what you might uncover. And then one note, just as someone who has used Wikipedia for many, many years, I don't talk about this a lot, but every once in a while I do mention that I was a Wikipedian for many years. And one issue with Wikipedia sources is that it's been around so long, a lot of the links are really out of date. Some of the earlier sources weren't really done very well. And so you want to be careful sometimes when you're going through this stuff. And it may be a little bit more of a hint of, hey, there's going to be something out there, but you're going to have to find it because this link doesn't work or there's some other issue with it going on. But I think that's also what she's getting at with it as well, is that it's not necessarily about like, okay, you go to Wikipedia, you see the source, and okay, you can accept it. It's more about you go to Wikipedia, you see the source, and it's like, okay, now let's go see that actual source. Let's read what it actually says.
You want to get as much related stuff as you can, since that'll let you contextualize the subject. Learning about it in isolation only gives you a fragment of the whole picture. Get greedy with it. You want to know everything about this subject, and that means you don't need to skimp on the sources you pull together. So once you've combed through every tangentially related Wikipedia page on your chosen subject, noted down a list of promising sources and what you expect to find in them, that's when you enter stage 2, hunting down some sweet sources. So now you've got a list of sources you think will lead to more information, and the odds are good most of them are going to be books. So you can either check your local library catalog and see if they have the sources you need, or you can give the titles a Google and see if you can find them online. Legally, of course. Sometimes Google Books has a preview available, and sometimes it even contains the pages you need. But mostly you're going to be looking for ebooks or library copies. Now, this advice all applies pretty much universally. No matter what you're trying to research, the process of finding sources is usually going to boil down to find a library or Google it and get really lucky.
Except in genealogy research. Now, for the overall picture of things, yes, it's going to be the same if you want to find the books and all of that about the history of that time or speak to specific people. But in genealogy, and with a lot of other research, if you really want to go beyond that, it's about diving into the archives and getting into the actual sources. But obviously with genealogy, we're utilizing a lot of databases that have the actual records in them. So Ancestry, Family Search, MyHeritage, all these various websites, along with, there's tons of databases, Genealogy Bank, American Ancestors by the NEHGS, and a whole bunch of more. I'm not going to spend too much time listing them, but basically we're getting into the databases where we're looking at the actual records or like pulling up actual newspapers. And while you can kind of get lucky and get maybe some of that through Google or Wikipedia, like Google and Wikipedia, that's just really scraping the surface of things. And yeah, if you're trying to build just an overall picture of a story, that might be useful. But for true in-depth research, you really need to dive into the primary sources yourself. And, especially like, it's not even as focused as much as books. Like, I would take a book and treat it like Wikipedia in that I'm going to look at the book's sources and go to them and see what they also say about the subject and basically see, is it true that what they're saying is actually what they're saying? I have a whole video on my main channel called The Truth About the Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean, which is all about that book, Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean by Edward Kritzler, and I go through his citations and I show how he gets a lot of things wrong. He does a lot of really bad genealogy and basically takes multiple people and merges them into one and creates this fantastical story that couldn't have happened because they were very different people. And I show the sources backing that up, the primary sources from around the world, even showing a comparison of the signatures of all these various men that he in the book put together as this one person. So even when you have a very well-sourced book or Wikipedia article or whatever, family tree on WikiTree or Genie or Ancestry or MyHeritage, all of that you need to just, take it with a grain of salt, and unless you've verified it yourself, you can't really, be too confident about it. And that might be getting into the real hardcore area of researching stuff and just kind of like double checking everything, But that's also a big part of what I was mentioning before with the genealogical proof standard. So since we're talking about Wikipedia, here's the page for the genealogical proof standard from Wikipedia. And one of the things that's correlating to what I'm talking about is resolution of any conflicting evidence. And so when you're looking at all of the evidence that's supporting a source, if there's something in that evidence that doesn't match up with what the source is saying, you need to figure out what's going on, because either the source got it wrong or the interpretation of the source was wrong. So you need to check that out, because there can be all sorts of reasons why a primary source is wrong. We know this very well with census records, because if a family wasn't home when the enumerator came around and the enumerator asked the neighbor, well, the neighbor might not know their ages that well, and all of a sudden someone who should be 12 might be 10, or someone who should be 36 is all of a sudden 30, and next thing you know, you're doing research and you're like, this looks like my family, but the ages are all off, or the origins are off, because maybe the neighbors didn't know that, well, they actually came from here. They thought, oh, well, they're English, aren't they? No, they were actually Irish. It could be any sort of little thing like that. All right, enough rambling. Let's get back to the video.
Let's say, for the sake of specificity, you're researching something historical, like a mythological figure, for example. In cases like this, you're going to need to start dealing with primary and secondary sources. Now, broadly, if you're studying a historical thing, the primary sources are going to be stuff that was written directly about that thing from people who were point blank on the thing or otherwise had first-hand experience with its thingness. The secondary sources are the stuff written about the primary sources, and thus they're at least one degree of separation away from the original thing.
But it's important to understand this when it comes to Wikipedia, because Wikipedia has very specific rules about no original research, which means that you should not be using primary sources on Wikipedia. While they do get used every once in a while, it's very, very rare. It's actually something that if people use, it'll tell other Wikipedians that are kind of like managing stuff and are nominating articles for deletion for whatever reason, or tagging different things for issues that it has. That's going to get tagged if you're using a lot of primary sources. It's all about secondary sources on Wikipedia. So when you go to Wikipedia, you're going to be dealing with largely secondary sources. But that's different than if you're researching a family tree, where you really do need to utilize a lot of primary sources, especially if you're trying to expand that family tree and identify specific information about an ancestor's life, or making a specific connection between different people within a family. So genealogy doesn't mesh well with actual Wikipedia, because genealogy relies much more on primary sources.
Written about the primary sources, and thus they're at least one degree of separation away from the original thing. And the number one rule in any kind of research is you always want to find the primary sources first. If they still exist, they don't always. If you're trying to learn about something and you have the option of reading a bunch of first-person accounts of that thing, or a book somebody wrote about those first-person accounts of that thing, choose the first-person accounts. It'll take longer to get through, but you'll get a much more accurate perspective. No text is free from bias, but the farther away the writer was from the subject they're writing about, the more bias will be present in their interpretation. It's like in the giant n-dimensional game of telephone that is history, the actual thing you're trying to research is the starting person, and the primary sources are all the people right next to the starting thing who probably heard it pretty clearly, but all the secondary sources are from farther down the line, where you're starting to get garbled interpretations of interpretations, and maybe somebody along the way started actively messing with the other players by not actually repeating what they heard in the first place, and it's a mess.
I always like to call this concept historical telephone, because we deal with it in genealogy all the time, of descendants of people writing about their ancestors that they only heard about through stories and never actually knew. So there's a lot of famous histories that are written that way. A great example from research I've done is for the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam, the history that relates to Rabbi Yuri Moses Halevi, who was a rabbi from Emden, Germany, who came down to Amsterdam to help the Jews escaping from Iberia to learn how to be Jewish again. But this history about him was written by, I think it was either his grandson or his great-grandson, who had not known him. He, wasn't there for a lot of this. And so a lot about what he writes is somewhat fantastical. Like, some of it's a little like, wow, that's quite a grand story, but there's nothing else that backs that up. And then on top of that, there's other primary sources that kind of negate contradict, I guess would be a better way, the things that he says. So especially a lot of the notarial records we have from Amsterdam, which date back very, very far, tell us the prayer houses that they were doing this stuff at and what was going on with that. And so the story that's told doesn't quite match up with the actual primary sources. But this sort of thing can be happening if you're researching family from the early 1900s or even family from the 1950s or 60s. A lot of this stuff you can have interpretations of that weren't quite correct. But yeah, the further you are from it, the less that you get from that. And yeah, I like that historical telephone sort of concept.
Let's say you're researching a Greek god or something, and you want to know what they were like back in the day. Your primary sources are going to be the myths about that god, or the hymns recorded in their worship. And even then, it's important to note that these sources were most likely translated from the original ancient Greek to English, and that translation adds a layer of bias as well. Really, for the sake of your own sanity, you gotta accept that you'll never be able to find the clear, unvarnished truth of the thing, but the closer you get, the clearer the image will be. But while primary sources will give you a good look at the thing in question, you actually do need secondary sources. Specifically, you need secondary sources that help you contextualize the primary sources. To understand the possible biases and factors present in the primary sources, you want to know who wrote them and when and what exactly was happening at the time.
This context of sources is extremely important in genealogy because we know through time records relating to a person may have different information, the contradicting information. So jumping back to this genealogical proof standard, that resolution of any conflicting evidence. But the other thing is analysis and correlation of the collected information, which is a very big part of the genealogical proof standard. Basically saying, if we want to prove that this is correct, we need to correlate it. So if we find a record of a person and we find another record of that person that we think is the same person, but we're not 100% sure, we need more to correlate. So if we have signatures on both items and we see it's definitely the same signature, okay, that's a correlation. Or maybe we're not sure, is that our Abraham Nunes? Then we look at the address. Oh, the address is not the address we know he was living at in that year. And then looking in the same record set, all of a sudden, oh yeah, here's our Abraham Nunes. So that can be the case sometimes. But then also the context of the record can help in understanding which record you might rely on more. So a great example of this are birth dates. A lot of times the birth date on a gravestone is incorrect, and it will be different than the actual birth record or even other records that are related to birth, such as baptismal records or circumcision records. So if you have a gravestone that's saying that grandma was born in 1912, but then you go look at the birth record and the birth record shows she was born in 1910, I trust the birth record a lot more because of the context than the grave, especially in that same consideration of the further away you are from something, the less trust, I don't know if that's the way to say it, but the bigger the possibility of a change of what's actually going on. So with the genealogical proof standard, that's really the big pieces that I think are the most important is this resolution of any conflicting evidence and analysis and correlation of the collected information.
Primary sources let you examine the thing. Secondary sources let you examine the primary sources. And it's very important to do both when you're doing research. You can't just take these sources at face value. Trust no one. And you gotta be aware that the writers all had their personal take on the subject. And the more you know about that take, the more you'll be able to extrapolate what parts of the original thing they might have been minimizing or putting the spotlight on. It'll help you get a clearer picture of the original. It's also important not to shy away from credible sources of information that don't seem to fit with what you already know about the subject. If you're only looking for stuff that agrees with you, you're not actually doing research, you're just looking to confirm what you already think. But this is another reason why it's very important to look at the context for your sources to judge whether or not they're actually credible. If your conflicting information is coming from I don't know, someone's unsourced Tumblr post, you might not want to assign it as much literary weight as the complete works of Homer. Context for your sources is seriously everything. I can't stress that enough. So you find the myths and the hymns, and then you find other versions of the same myths and hymns, and then you find some secondary sources talking about the authors of those myths and hymns, and you've got so much information about this mythical figure and the people who wrote about them and when all this happened, and you don't know what to do with it. This brings me to the next step. Bury yourself in notes. Take notes on everything. No, really. This isn't like class notes where you write stuff down so you can pass tests on it later. This is a whole different ballgame. If you're researching a historical or mythical figure, write down everything they did. If you've got accounts from different time periods, write down when they're from and who put them down. Anything interesting about the writer's lives, write that down too. If your general approach to note-taking is the same as mine, as in, oh, I'll remember this, I don't need to write it down, that doesn't apply here.
So this is actually really interesting to hear, because for genealogy, this is why I like Ancestry so much, because with Ancestry, as you find the sources in their database, you can then instantly connect it to the person in your family tree. They also have lots of places to put notes and comments and all of that. So when I'm doing straight up research, my preference to do that is on Ancestry, because the system connects it all together to make this note-taking basically really, really easy. A lot of the other websites with family tree building also have similar tools to do this stuff. Basically make it really easy to connect it to what you're building. So you can go back and reference what is it that you use to figure out this thing. And I have definitely done it where I've found something and didn't write it down or didn't save it or whatever, because it was like, oh, that was so easy to find. And then go back to find it, and it's like, I can't remember how I found it. I don't remember what search I used. I don't remember this. I don't remember that. And then it's like lost to time.
This isn't about memorizing, it's about putting all your information in one place so you can deal with it all at once later. In your notes, you want to distill down everything you could possibly use from the original sources. You want to make it so you never have to return to the original text, because everything you could possibly be looking for is right there. If you're writing a paper or something else that needs direct attribution, maybe note down some useful quotes with page numbers too, just to make your life easier down the line. This will leave you with a giant pile of information loosely connected to the actual subject at hand. And if you're wondering what you're supposed to do with this pile, break out the thumbtacks and string. Who's ready to connect some dots? Now that you have a huge heap of everything you know about this person, place, or thing, you get to start on the fun part, filling in the gaps. You have to take the mess of information you've acquired, organize it into categories, lay it all out, and start bringing the big picture together. This is where you get to be creative. You have all these static points of data, you just need to find a best fitting curve that connects all the dots into one coherent narrative. Basically, a thesis that all the evidence you've collected supports. It's pure creative puzzle solving, and it's gonna be great. So, once you've constructed your thesis out of thumbtacks and yarn, you just gotta polish it up to be presentable. That's a whole nother video Blue already did, so if you're curious, go ahead and check that out.
Alright, so that was a pretty good video. A lot of stuff that kind of relates to genealogy, but not really a way that genealogists would do it, especially at the end there, where it's kind of like taking all the different pieces and then you figure it out. With genealogy, I think it's a bit more structured, especially just in the sense that there's usual steps that everyone takes of like, okay, first figure out the parents, then possibly figure out the siblings or the parents' siblings, and then take the parents to the parents further. And, it's just kind of continuing that. And so, it's usually like filling in the gaps of people's lives. So if you don't know this part about someone's life, then start researching that and try to figure out what can you extrapolate from that. But it is very interesting to see her thought process on how she does research and where she starts and how she goes about things, which it does, relate in a lot of different ways on just typical research of just how to find the sources. And I feel like that's really what a good genealogist is they're good at finding things. So I get comments all the times on my videos about when I, don't know something about a specific population group, and people are like, how can you not know that? When in reality, there are so many various population groups and all these various different stories about the histories of all these thousands of different population groups. And within those population groups, then there are their own unique histories that are also interesting. And so to know all of that would be ridiculous. I'm only human and every genealogist is only human. But what genealogists are really good at is figuring out where to find something. If I need to find a record from this area, how do I go about to figure that out? So like the way that I would do research in that sense is if I had a town where I need to figure out what's there, well, first I would go to the genealogy version of Wikipedia, which is Family Searches Wiki, where you can find all sorts of towns or populations or just all various sorts of things that tell you what's available genealogically. So I find that town in there, and then I look through and see what does it tell me. And these pages can tell me what archives are available, how to contact them, what records are available online, where they're at, is it a paywall to get to them, where can I find other information that might be related to it, and then there can be other stuff connected about what sort of specific records I'm looking for. So maybe I'm looking for church records, or maybe I'm looking more for occupational related records, and so maybe they have tax records available. But then I'm going to go further and I am going to see what else is out there. Are there historical groups or genealogical groups related to this subject? Or going off that occupational idea, maybe there's records related to the company that you know that person worked for. So when I did my research on Steve Heimler's family tree, I looked into his family history with the Hind and Dausch Paper Company in Michigan and found all sorts of stuff. But either way, I think this video was a great overview of things, especially for someone who doesn't have any idea on how to start researching. And honestly, I'm not too surprised now, but I used to kind of feel similar to what she said in the beginning of, I guess people don't find this intuitive as I do. And, it does take a little bit of, training in a sense for people to kind of realize like all these various places they can look into or how to find certain things. But I think I'm going to react to a lot more videos like this talking about how to research. And if you enjoyed this reaction and you'd like to see more reactions just like this, be sure to check out this video of mine right here. Thank you to my Patreon patrons and YouTube members.